Tonight, we have the pleasure of having back one of my favorite people that I've met doing this, Mr. Matthew Smith. And guys, if you follow me on Instagram, you've seen that I've been sharing his videos because he's been cranking out in the past couple weeks 3 of the best videos that I've seen lately, all on Seattle, a couple on Seattle itself, the history, and then also the fire. And Matthew, welcome. I want to say your work is outstanding, and I know from talking to you that these are just the first couple of videos you've done, and put time into, and man, did they come out good.
Thank you. I really appreciate that, Matt. Thanks for the warm introduction. It's great to be back on your show. And yeah, man, we've got a lot to talk about.
Oh, do we ever? And I'm looking at it, and we talked about doing this probably around Christmas, right?
Mm-hmm.
We were getting together, and our schedules just didn't meet up in January. So I looked into it hard over the break, and then I put it aside, and then forgot about it for a couple of weeks. Then you threw out the video, and I was like, oh wow, and watching the way you break it down, and you did such a great job, because not only did you have the visual there, but the detail, and you could tell you put a lot of effort into it, and the work was just outstanding, but what gets to me is this is the same story or pattern that we see across these early cities in America.
Yeah, it's the same pattern. Yeah, and you had kind of given me a little bit of a challenge, because I was asking you what you would like to focus on next, because we were talking about electric architecture and all the cool stuff. And you said, well, why don't you focus on Seattle? And I live right here, just north of Seattle, so I thought, what a great opportunity. So I went into it hard. I cleaned out the Seattle Public Library and the King County Public Library of all the Seattle history books I could get my hand on. I got a stack of 24, couple of dozen books here. I've got to get back to the libraries.
Well, you could tell you used them, man. I mean, it was such an extensive and the history. I mean, people think about Seattle, and it's got to be a short history, first of all, because of the time frame that we're talking. It didn't become a city until the late 1800s.
Yeah, well, it actually became a chartered city in the 1860s, but it was very small, and we'll get into that. But I'm from Newark, New Jersey, and that's like 350 years old. And so a city like that, an East Coast city, is much harder. And I studied architecture there, and I studied infrastructure planning in college as well. And we looked at Newark. So I have a little bit of familiarity with, looking at the infrastructure of a city from kind of like bird's eye, and seeing how it works, and looking at the history of development and so forth. And so with Seattle, it's much more accessible in terms of like kind of wrapping my head around the history. There's 200 years less in terms of like, what we consider like U.S. history in this region. We're only talking about 150 years to go through. And with that time frame, we have the advent of film and photography as we know it and understand it. And so there's a lot of documentation. And so, I thought, what a great opportunity, to take sort of a forensics approach and like overlay, the timeline narrative with the photographic evidence, with infrastructure development and like population statistics. And along with that, this pivotal event of the Great Fire in 1889, which is kind of, I found that to be like the key to unlocking a lot of this, like, mystery history. Right.
Yeah. Oh yeah. when you started describing it to me, because you had, I think you went on a tour or something, and you sent me some photos of some underground stuff, and that's kind of what kicked off this whole Seattle with us. Was we're like, oh, we should look about underground cities, and we were talking about a couple different things, and one of our buddies from the Patreon, Jeremiah, is out in Kansas City, and he was going to do a look out there in the tunnels out there, and we're going to kind of do, look at a couple cities and geographically. And in Seattle, we started looking, and there was the tunnels, and then we saw, oh, there was a fire, and of course there's a World's Fair. And you start looking, and the boxes all get checked, and I'm like, this is just like Chicago. This is just like Buffalo. This is just like, put an old world city in there.
Right.
And what's amazing is you get two versions of it, right? We get the European history version, which is the narrative, right? The US history. And then there's the real version that we're starting to uncover bit by bit, that's out there, but it wasn't told to us in the narrative, but it's in the books. There's a lot of keys to it in the books that, as you start digging in and looking at, when were these buildings built or founded, who built them, what was the time frame they were built in, and you start seeing all these commonalities across the board, it starts to make sense. And I think you just did a great job of Seattle, of digging into it and giving, not only, like I said, the detail behind it, but the visual, because I think so many people nowadays need that visual to back it up. Because with a lot of this, it's so hard to believe. You wouldn't believe it unless you saw it with your eyes. If you show, and I'm sure you have some pictures and things to show us, that from some of these buildings from the 1800s. I mean, I looked, again, I didn't go too hard into it, but what threw me off were the schools in the 1890s in like the Seattle, Tacoma area. These things are castles.
Yeah. They're marvelous, aren't they?
Yeah. And I'm laughing because I'm like, how many kids are there, first of all? Because the population itself is relatively low until 1900. And it's like, it just doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
And you're like, well, why would they build these castles, multi-story castles, for a school? And it's not just one, there's multiple. And it doesn't, it doesn't match. It's like apples and oranges between the time frame that we're in and what we're told, and then what we're seeing on the other side of it.
Yeah. Don't believe your lying eyes.
Yeah.
And I've been looking at this old world architecture stuff for a number of years now, and like, studying it, and like looking at a lot of other people's research. And there's some good research out there, and there's some, there's a lot of rabbit holes as well. But my sort of personal mantra to guide me through this has been that stones don't lie. Right. And so that's kind of been my bumper rails. That idea that if I can just really, look hard at, the buildings themselves. And I understand that there's all sorts of, trickery when it comes to, photographic manipulation, even way back when. But the buildings represent, the age and the era and the epoch, the economy, the consciousness, and all that of the time that they came out of. So that's been, and plus, having a background in architecture and so forth. But just to rewind a little bit, you brought up the underground Seattle aspect, and that is what I started with. That's what kind of got me going, and it's right here, like it's right downtown in Pioneer Square, and you can go and take a tour, which I did with my wife, and recorded what I saw and put out a video. Actually, I had to start my podcast just to put that video out. Marvelous Old World on YouTube, and that one took off. The Seattle Underground, it's got almost 20,000 views, and I was really surprised because I had like 35 subscribers when I released it, and it just took off. And thank you for helping to put that out there and drawing attention to it, Matt. I really appreciate that.
Oh, my pleasure, man. That's the point of this, right? Is we share together, and like I said, I get as much joy as you do watching that video take off like that. We were we were exchanging text back and forth, and you're like, it's up to a couple hundred views. Then you're, oh, it's a couple thousand views. And then it's up over. I'm like, yes. I'm like, it's getting, but see, that's why we do this, right? We're not doing it for the views, so to speak. It's for people to see it and just take it in and maybe do a little research on their own. And that's the beautiful part about this. I go through your comment sections on the videos, and I love going through my comment section too, to see what people are into it. And they're like, oh, I'm from such and such an area around here. I'm going to go check out my town. Yeah.
I love that. And the feedback has been really positive and really insightful. And the comment that I really appreciate that I've gotten a lot is people are saying, like, finally an architect is looking at this. And it's like, I get that, because I've been, into what you're saying, this is a collaboration. I just have a set of experience, having been a builder and a designer of buildings most of my life, starting in high school and even as a kid. So I'm used to looking at structures and analyzing them, doing remodels, doing design work. So I have some sense of what it takes to build a thing, and put it together and like pull all the pieces together. And it's an architect is kind of like the conductor of an orchestra, so I have that sensibility I can bring to this conversation. But it's folks like yourself, and there's a lot of people out there like just doing a lot of really great research. And, this is one of the most positive aspects of this type of technology, there's a lot of pitfalls and so forth when we get into the digital age that we're in. But this, the power of it is right here, that people across the planet really can observe what's around them and then share notes.
Yeah, it's a collaboration, right? And that's how I look at this. I look at this as, a collective effort. And if everybody does a little bit together, we have a chance to start making some real progress and unlocking some of these questions that we have.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, like we're saying, we're pushing it forward, and we're going back to the source, though. That's the key, is we're going back to their words at the time.
Yeah.
And that doesn't match with what we're being told now. And that's where we're analyzing these discrepancies and saying, wait a second, hold on. In the book from this time, it says this, but now we've spun it, and now you're saying it's this. And that's what is huge in this, because they have done the word salad, right? They put their spin on it, and now they want you to think of things as one way, when in reality they happened quite differently. And it's a lot older in many aspects than I think we've been led to believe.
Now, you've got a picture up there of I haven't seen this building. Every time I look, there's some other marvelous old world building. And this is amazing. It says 1909 on there. So to me, maybe I haven't seen it because the focus of my research has been like the first, really the last half of the 19th century. So 1850 through 1900, because those to me are like the pivotal years where the city founders do their thing. There's Indian Wars at the beginning of that. Then there's the founding of the city. Then there's the early years of development. Then there's a great conflagration in 1889. Washington becomes a state, which is a huge piece of the puzzle. I just kind of inserted into it, and it just brings a lot of other things into focus. So I'd like to talk about that. And then, there's the turn of the century, and then the city just takes off. So it's that pivotal 50 years from 1850 to 1900 where so much of the mystery it unravels when you start looking closely at it. So let me show you. Can I do a quick screen share?
Go right ahead.
So if I share my screen and I'm looking at us, what are we going to do? Let's see.
And that's one of the things that interests me about Seattle and the story is it seems like it's one step forward, two steps back. And then all of a sudden there's this giant leap forward.
Right. Right. And that seems by design.
Yep. Because in
Right.
the
That giant leap forward is part of the mystery, because it's like, the more I study it, the more I realize like there was foresight in all of it. Like before the disaster, before the crisis, it seems apparent that there was already an awareness of where they wanted to take things.
Mm-hmm.
At the crisis, in this case, the Great Fire, and they'll even say this, oh, what a good fortune, because now we got to rebuild and remake our city.
Yeah, and even before that, I didn't realize, and I think this was on your podcast, you were talking about this, how in the 1850s during the Indian Wars, the city vacated. The entire population left because of the Indian Wars. And I was like, wow, that's another, okay, well, what happens when people are gone? That's a nice time to reset some things and reclaim some land and get rid of some buildings and things like that.
Are you talking about in Seattle?
Yes.
Huh. I wasn't aware of it, that the city emptied out during that time.
Yeah, it was like, I think it was, what was it? It was 55, 56.
Well, that was, what they called them the Indian Wars. It's
Yeah.
I thought from my research that it wasn't that heavy in Seattle proper, but that more like Yakima, which is more sort of south central.
Oh, you know what it was? It was Tacoma.
Okay.
That's what it was. It was Tacoma, Washington, where, 55, 56 city emptied.
Right. That makes more sense.
And like when we talked about earlier, in earlier discussions, we talked about the three cities, right? It was Tacoma, Seattle, and
Ellensburg. Or
yes,
no, I'm sorry. Go ahead. Three cities.
that were all battling for the capital.
Yes.
At the time.
So add to that Spokane and
Yes.
Ellensburg. Now, and Olympia, of course, ended up becoming the capital. But the wild thing is that in 1889, within 2 months, there was the Seattle fire on June 6, 1889. Then there was the Ellensburg fire on July 10th. And then there was the Spokane fire, I think, on August 6th or 10th. So, I mean, talk about a long, hot summer. And so I mentioned the Washington becoming a state. And what I just found out was there was the Washington Territory had resisted for decades becoming a state. Once the Washington was established as a territory, it resisted becoming a state. There was, I think, 4 referendums that were voted down. And so finally, there was a big push in the late 1880s towards statehood again. Then there was a convention that was started, I believe, in May, where delegates from all over the state came together. So picture this in Washington, D.C., the federal government, like they want to incorporate Washington into statehood and, put another star on the flag.
Yep.
And so imagine the circumstances where there's all this popular resistance, and that's what I'm reading into it. And then finally there's a state convention, May of 1889. All of a sudden, downtown Seattle burns down, and just downtown, just the business district. Then Ellensburg a month later, then Spokane a month later, and all 3 of them were vying to become the capital. Right?
And it was just a dry spring, though, Matthew.
It was just really hot and windy that year.
I love it. It's the same story over and over again. I mean, you just mentioned, that sequence of events is the same thing that happened in Chicago in 1871. It was, fire in the business district, reclaim and rebuild. It's like, oh my gosh, it's almost like a blueprint.
Yeah. And then it's November 11th, 1889 is when finally, I guess the president signed the legislation that brought Washington in. So you have convention, 3 urban fires, then statehood is finally established. And it just, to me, it's like,
And that's it. That's in a 6-month span, right? I mean,
all of that's within 6 months.
yeah. And you're talking, okay, after such a tragic fire, you wouldn't really normally rush in to any commitments after that. You'd kind of be focused on your area and rebuilding and getting your feet back on the ground, right?
Matt, they were rebuilding while the rubble was still.
That's the same thing in Chicago, right? They said that the ground wasn't even done smoldering and they were already rebuilding.
It's the same. That story repeats over and over again. That these
and why
vinegar, these townsfolk just the spirit moved them to like the phoenix out of the ashes. But
well, and the key point that you make, and you're one of the few people that really emphasize this and make sure to emphasize this over and over, is that why the business district, what is kept there, and the key is the records.
The records.
That's as important as the building in many instances, and people don't pay attention to that. They're like, oh, it was just a great fire, it burnt down a bunch of buildings. No, it destroyed valuable records. That was land ownership and things like that. That was historical records of who built these buildings, the history of the city, all gone.
Right. And then, and again, it's what a great opportunity we have now to roll out a new infrastructure to fix our plumbing problems and, plug us into the electrical grid and so forth. And in Seattle's
case, me, one of the things I want you to go over with us tonight is the leveling.
Yeah, I was just going to
say. That blows my mind. I look at that and I'm like, what? They just leveled the city. That's all.
Yeah, it's wild. So you have the fire wipes out downtown, and along with rolling out the new infrastructure is completely terraforming this entire landscape. So they cut down all the hills, and the photos it blew my mind when I was looking at these photographs of the Seattle regrade projects, and it went on for decades. It wasn't just Denny Hill is the big one, but there was Jackson Hill. It was happening all over the place.
Matthew, do you think any of these hills could have been old mounds?
Well, probably.
That's one of the things, and I'll let you go with this in a sec, but one of the things that I see, and the more I dig it, because I'm looking into ancient America right now, and one of the things you're seeing a lot is these hills, and they were mounds, and then they put golf courses on them, or like you said, they wiped them out, they leveled them. And it's such an interesting thing that, to find them out west would make sense as well. I mean, they would go coast to coast.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that. I mean, I know that we have like midden pits and midden mounds out here where, centuries of seashells and so forth that are indicative of, long-term settlement of, the native populations all around the Salish Sea area, which is, also known as the Puget Sound. But that they will actually be like engineered mounds is an interesting thought.
Because that's what blows my mind about some of these, because I look at the size of them and they're man-made, but you would never believe it, because you're like, how could these people who didn't supposedly have any tools build these massive mounds? Because when we think mounds, we're thinking of like a small hill. Some of these mounds were 40, 50 feet high. Hundreds of feet long.
Right. Oh, am I sharing screen right now, Matt?
Yes, it's a picture inside of your main screen.
Do you see this high school building?
Yes.
Okay.
It looks exactly like the one that I was just showing, right?
I know, but this one is from 1884. And in 1884, there was like 9,000 people in Seattle. This is the kind of stuff that's been like blowing my mind.
And that's what doesn't make sense, right? It doesn't add up. Why would you? Where is the labor coming from? Where is the demand coming from for a building like this to be a high school?
Super tall ceilings. And this is before statehood. Okay. We're a territory. And just the scale of this, and never mind the attention to detail and the exquisite nature of this construction in our Antiquitech And this building survived until the 50s, and then they put Interstate 5 through downtown Seattle, and just, this is gone. But before they disappeared the whole building, they disappeared the tower.
Yep.
And you see that over and over again, where
It's
buildings are kept for a little while, but the towers are lopped off.
it's interesting you say that, because my friend Tartari Ann just shared a photo today of the Cathedral of the Holy Cross in Boston, and that's what they did. It's basically the same building, but it's been castrated. The big towers have been leveled to a point where the top of the building is all now even.
Yeah, I actually think that's a very appropriate metaphor.
Yeah, it is. I mean, that's what they're doing to these things. They are literally castrating them. They're taking away that connection. These towers aren't just towers when you start looking into things.
Yeah, and that gets us back to our conversations about electric architecture, just pulling etheric energy down.
Yep.
And what these antenna, this Antiquitech, was actually doing, and where they're radiant fireplaces in here helping to heat this thing. Because if you're going to be building this big out in really remote places, and again, it's like, where's the window glass coming from? Where's the copper for the roofs coming from? Never mind the brick factories. There's tons of materials that go into this that have to be fabricated. They have to be brought from somewhere, and we weren't connected to the Transcontinental Railroad for several more years. And Seattle, what they'll tell you, was pretty much, it's not landlocked. Obviously, you have a water route where you can bring stuff up from like San Francisco, say, by sea, but you don't have an overland route to Seattle beyond wagon trails for
There's
a long
no interstates at the time, guys. I mean, you can't just hop on the highway and bring.
No, you got to get through the Cascade Mountains.
Yep.
Or so the Columbia River, which divides Oregon and Washington, there's a railroad there now. So you had to come, along the Columbia River, and then to Portland and up from there, or out to sea, and then, by sea. And there was no the railroad eventually, by I think 1874, went as far as Tacoma and then stopped. And it didn't make it up to Seattle. So Seattle was isolated for a very, very long time. And yet we have buildings like that just popping up like mushrooms.
Yep. It's the same story. The population does not match the infrastructure at the time. And, and it just blows your mind, because you think about it and you're looking at this, and this, in many cities would have eventually been turned into an insane asylum, or an orphanage of some sorts. And it's like, why? What was the real purpose of this building? Who really built it and when? Because it doesn't match. I mean, look at the aging on it too. That doesn't make any sense. They tell us that these buildings were, built within the last decade, but they have hundreds of years worth of aging on them.
Now, I'll show you another one. We'll just bounce around here a little bit.
Oh yeah, let's do it.
So this is the Occidental Hotel.
Okay, this one, it gets me, because is this the one that you showed the silhouette of it in today's pictured in like today's environment, with the guys with the little hats out in front of it?
With the it's not this exact spot right now. If you go to Pioneer Square, is like a wedge-shaped parking garage.
Okay.
Yeah. And so this building was here prior to, I'll show you, prior to this building. So this is the Seattle Hotel. This was built after the fire in 1890. That building right here was built in 1882, I believe. And again, the population and all that stuff, there was maybe 8,000 people.
Yeah.
And there's buildings like this all over, and it gets crazier.
Is the Cobb building one of those?
What's that?
Is one of those the Cobb building?
Cobb?
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm not familiar with that one.
because it looks just like.
As I said, every time I look, there's more of these buildings
I'm
that I haven't seen
Let me
before.
see if I can find it because yeah, I was. It's one of the buildings that looks, and it may be the same. Yeah, it says. No, that's definitely not it. This is more of a square building. Never mind.
Okay. So, and that's the thing is there's a whole batch of architecture that's pre-fire, and then there's a whole batch of exquisite architecture that's said to be post-fire. So again, we have this Occidental building.
And this is 1884 pre-fire, right?
Correct, or 1882 even. Yeah, it's early 1880s. And again, look at the scale of this. So here's these guys, they don't even get to the bottom, to the top of the stair from the street. And then you get these weird windows that are, right down at grade, which is.
They love building on angles, right? I mean, every street level outside is always sloped and they just built into it.
Yeah, but they do it in these funny ways, right? Like not like this part down here is never thought out. It's just windows that go down into the ground.
And they're not uniform.
No, right.
It doesn't, the windows closest to us are much larger than those in the next section because they get smaller and smaller to the point where you're level at the other side of the building.
And I have images where this appears to be all level, which those are renderings, but it's curious to me that at one point the artists, or it's say the people working for newspapers to promote the city, we call it they call it boosterism, right? Yep. And that's another footnote that I'd like to get into what that really is all about. But there's a photo, I'll see if I can find it, or an image that shows that this is level and that this slope isn't here. So it's all, it's all over the place sometimes. And you have to just really sit with it and try to piece it together to make sense of it sometimes. But again, if this is 1882 and there's a few thousand people in Seattle.
Hey, Matthew, look at the size of those doors.
Look at the size of it. This is, if you took
12-foot doors, just the door to the top of the door, not even to the top of the arch.
10 feet, easy 10 feet.
Yeah. I mean,
and then
that's
14
massive.
feet to the arch.
And the windows on the second floor. I mean, look at the gentleman in the window. He's about a third of the way up.
Yes.
Or lady, whatever it is.
Yeah. This is a 15-foot ceiling in here.
Oh my God, look at those.
Can you imagine the interior spaces in this? It would be glorious
but again, okay, let's go. We're in Seattle, right? Mm-hmm. How are they heating these buildings? And it's not with wood fireplaces, not with 15-foot high ceilings. I'm sorry.
I mean, there is a lot of wood here, but like if it was heated with wood, I would imagine that these would be chimneys, and it's possible. I just don't see soot. So it makes me think that these may be some kind of convection system.
No, and that's just my whole gripe with that time frame is these, grand buildings with these large rooms, high ceilings. Yet you're telling me you're going to heat this with one wood pit, one fireplace in that.
Or even if you had wood, even if you had fireplaces in every room, it's, are you really hauling wood to burn through these old buildings? Yeah. Is that really what's going on?
Yeah.
Why would you build it that big in the first place? And who's doing this? I mean, if you look at this,
look at the top.
This is stone and brick, and there's no piece of it that's untouched, that's not sculpted.
And it's all uniform. It's, and granted, at this time, one of the things I did find is that, and I'll have to find the catalog, but I have a catalog from the 1800s where they manufactured a lot of these exterior pieces. So you could piecemeal it to an extent on the outside, but not to the level of detail that we see in some of these buildings.
Yeah, you had catalogs, and you could go to a boneyard and look at different column motifs, and but at the same time, that's all well and good. Where's that plant? Where is that in relation to Seattle? that
Exactly.
there's a
In the 1890s, guys, we're not
in the
talking, they wouldn't
1880s,
just
the
have
early
these all over the country. There's
and,
still Indians going around supposedly scalping people at this time.
and again, it's we don't have the railroad yet, so you have to manufacture this somewhere somehow and design a building around it where it all fits and makes sense and then put it together. And there's another piece of this that people talk to the extent they talk about, what does it take to design something? It also has to be engineered. There's a whole engineering process that goes into it. And so that's a piece of the picture that needs to be considered as well. So things like this take time, they take resources. It's not enough to say well, we had old world bricklayers and masons back then. That's not enough. And I want to show you something. We'll jump into the fire because I know it's impossible not to sort of bounce around.
Oh, this is going to be like,
this.
yeah, this is like one of those bouncy balls that has like 6 sides to it, and good luck trying to catch it. It's, yeah, we're going to be all over the place, but that's what this is. This is kind of a free for all dive into it because there's so many questions, right? And I know you've done hours upon hours of research on this, and I'm sure you don't have many answers.
I've got more better questions now.
Yeah, exactly. Yep. Yeah. There's the, yep.
All right, I'm gonna show you this one. So this is that building after the fire. You see this?
Now, what blew that up? Because it wasn't fire. That wasn't strictly a fire that got to that. That is
when I
demolished.
See pictures of this, it takes my breath away.
And look at the Jesuits in front posing with their work.
Always the top hat dudes. And then you've got these, I guess fellows with fire hats on. But honestly, looking like they just shot a rhinoceros.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and the thing that you even mentioned in your video is they will admit that they went around dynamiting buildings to supposedly create a fire line. Mm-hmm. Right? I mean, it's just so preposterous that
they come right out and say that that was a practice at the time to, like you said, to dynamite buildings to make a fire line. And in Seattle, one of the interesting things I found out was the fire chief was away, and there was an interim fire chief. He was off on a convention, so there's an interim fire chief. The fire happens, the mayor takes over. So the mayor becomes the commander in chief of operations and making big decisions about what gets blown up. And
how convenient,
right,
that the fire chief's gone. It's like, oh, Jesus, just like, yeah, George Bush just wasn't in DC on 9/11. It just so happened to be a coincidence,
Yeah. He was reading My Pet Goat upside down.
Yeah, it's just the story, and again, look at the devastation, guys. You can look at the pictures of San Francisco that I talked about with Casey. You'll see the same pictures. You look at my Chicago episode, the same photos. Peshtigo, same pictures. And it's like,
what gets me is, where's the fucking building?
Yep. Well, this same thing happened in Boston in the 1870s, I believe, early 1880s. Same thing. I mean, it would be the same picture. The buildings are like 9/11, right? It's dust.
Yeah.
You see some brick, right? Some of it, you see some piling of rubble in areas, but for the most part, it's dust. Unless you're going to try and sell me on the fact that as soon as this brick hit the ground, they were picking it up and reorganizing it to rebuild.
Now that's one of the mysteries of 9/11 is what happened to the building.
Yep.
I mean, even if you buy that it collapsed into itself because of the amount of heat on the joints connecting the floor trusses to the steel columns, there's still going to be a pile of steel columns, and it just wasn't there. I mean, it was to some extent.
The amount of rubble did not match what should have come out of that.
Yeah.
And it was melted by jet fuel.
It's hard. And again, it's just hard to wrap your head around this. And so I look at a building like this and I feel the same. I have the same, sense of,
think about the heat, guys, or that it would cause for this to happen strictly by fire alone. It's impossible. It
Yeah.
doesn't make any sense. Even if the roof is all wood, I mean, it would just have to be the perfect fire.
And so in one of the things they talk about how after the fire, so before the fire, it was all wood shacks, right? Ramshackle, shanty town, everything's made out of wood. That's a story they give us over and over again. I heard that, about Chicago, so many times. And then here's what the pictures tell us. And then you look at the aftermath, and again, it's gone, like it's been pulverized to dust. Now, and I have to say, Matt, like I've been looking at this really hard for the last month and a half, 2 months, and it takes a lot out of me, man. Like this stuff is intense.
Oh, I'm with you, man. A lot of it. I forgot who I was talking with the other day, but I was saying this exact thing because when I got deep into the Buffalo Wars of the early 1800s, and you start looking what the government did. Oh, it was talking with my guy on Friday, and you start talking about what the government did to the people, and you're like, it's so dark that it just weighs on you, and you're like, man, how could they do this, and smile at you like it's for your own good.
Mm-hmm.
Just eat the pill, swallow the pill. It's okay, it'll be fine, it'll work out in the end.
Yeah. Yeah.
No, 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 no. 1 + 1 does not equal 2 in this case, because you look at this building, look at the size of this. I mean, these guys don't even come up to the top of the steps. And then in the next photo, you don't even have the frame of it anymore. You have two, and ironically, the 2 columns are left out front,
Right.
like the 2 pillars, and everything else is just demolished.
The spire, I call it. So here's another example. And like I said, every time I turn around, I'm finding more photos of the past. So this here is the Yesler building, and that would have been kitty corner to the building we're just looking at, the Occidental building. So this is a whole strip. The Occidental building goes the other way. This is a whole strip, and same time period. 18,
Untouched?
huh?
Untouched?
Well, this is before the fire.
Okay.
This is what I'm saying, where they say it's all wood
All
building.
wood, shanty town, right?
Yeah, this is what was there.
Well, and the other thing you mentioned in your video about that building is you look at the devastation, but yet there's a half, 3/4 of a telephone pole right outside.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't make any sense, guys. If we're talking about these tremendous heats, the first thing that's going to go are those poles. But you have half a pole left, yet the building is gone.
Well, in the video I just released, dealing with the Seattle fire of 1889, I show that picture of the Occidental building in its as a ruin after the fire. See if I can find it again. But then in the next photo taken right after, where did it go? In any case, the spire is gone, but the telephone pole is also gone too. So it looked to me like they had sort of, this photo doesn't show it, but interesting. Yeah, you see different things every time you look at these. There was a telephone pole right here, and they blew up this portion, and then there's another photo of them looking through this archway.
Yep.
Where this portion isn't here. So it was clear evidence. I don't know, maybe it's hard to see. It was those photos were taken from a different angle, but it clearly showed that they dynamited or did something to remove this top portion, and that telephone pole had been sheared off. So in my mind, it's the same, it's the same dynamite that they used to make their fire breaks that they used to bring down the rest of the rubble.
Yep.
So where they, again, the hard questions is, what was the real intention of them dynamiting during the fire, these brick and stuff? Like, look at this. You're going to tell me there's a fire across the street, so you're going to come inside of these buildings and start setting up dynamite.
Yep.
So they don't burn down first and spread the fire? That makes no sense.
Yeah, I don't get it. It doesn't look like those things would really fuel the fire too much.
Yeah, so these aren't made of wood. This is like feet thick of brick.
Well, that's the other thing. It's not a brick facade.
Mm-mm.
These are 3 to 6 feet thick walls of brick
Mm-hmm.
here.
And look at the exquisite detail. Like, let's just take a moment
Yeah.
to
Yeah, I mean, you
take
look
this
at
in. This is
the
old world city. This could be old world New Orleans or Paris or anywhere.
I mean, the flashing up top alone, it's top notch.
Yeah, it's breathtaking. And then to consider again, like how they just disappeared it, how they disappeared all of this. And I'm at that point now where I just have to, you know, I just have to kind of take a deep breath and conclude that they got rid of this stuff on purpose, and that these fires are part of some other nefarious, sinister scheme. And a lot of that becomes revealed when you look at the regrade project that followed the fire, where the buildings that didn't get taken down by the, buildings that didn't get lost to the fire were taken down for the regrade project.
Yep.
And buildings that supposedly were just built. And
That's
so here I'm showing this one because this is, we mentioned boosterism before. So newspapers would, pay artists to come, to sketch out buildings that they would reprint and distribute across the land, to promote the city. And so why is this important is because in this book that I mentioned in my videos, let's see if I can find this here right quick. I find this important. This is I got into this distant corner, and the one of the authors, Jeffrey Oxner, is an architecture professor at University of Washington. He's been there since since '88. And this is a definitive analysis of the early architecture of Seattle, and talking about the influence of H.H. Richardson on Seattle architecture. And H.H. Richardson is like the first of the three pillars of, what are considered the three pillars of American architecture. There's Richardson, Louis Sullivan, and then Frank Lloyd Wright. Right. And so Richardson is said to have influenced this architectural style that we see in a lot of these photographs, and they call it Richardsonian Romanesque. And these images, maybe not so much I would associate with Richardsonian Romanesque, but like the Pioneer Building, for instance, and I'll show you that in a moment here. But so why I mentioned this book is because in the preface, the authors talk about how, in piecing together the history of Seattle's early built environment, there were no records. And so, and what they attribute that to is that after records were lost to the fire, and then there was a tremendous, I mean, mind-bending building blitz that happened immediately after the fire, where I have 3,465 new buildings are said to have been built in like the first 12 to 18 months.
Oh my
and
gosh.
250 of those were brick and stone buildings just in the downtown core that had just burned down. And so it just kind of makes me pause and wonder if is that even possible?
Is that plausible? Yeah, that just doesn't seem to add up.
Yeah. And then so what they say is that this building blitz happened from like 1890, and then went as far as like 1892, and then there was an economic crash. Yep. Called the financial panic of 1893. And so all of the buildings shut down for several years, and all the architects left town with their records. And that's why we don't, and this is what they say in this book, this is why we don't have drawings and records of these buildings that were built immediately in the wake of the fire. So it's like the plot thickens. And so what they have instead is what they say they say this in this book, that they base their history account on the boosterism of newspapers. And the newspapers use that term to like promote the city. So they go through old newspaper records, and that's a lot of what the history of at least Seattle, and I would bet this would be common in a lot of cities, is based on newspaper accounts, because the records were lost for one reason or another, either due to fire or due to, like in this case, they say the economic crash of 1893, and the architects just left because there was no more work. So really, and then like, but the newspaper, at least in the case of Seattle, was owned by Henry Yesler, who was like, one of the founding fathers of Seattle, and he's a shady dude. I've looked into Henry Yesler, and they credit him with all sorts of things, like having the first sawmill in town, and all the way up through like building the Pioneer Building, which I'll show you, because that, again, that's like an example of what they consider Richardsonian Romanesque. And you see this in courthouses, this type of, heavy emphasis on this like rusticated facade and, expressive stonework and this kind of thing.
Well, what's interesting, I don't know how much you've dug into it, but this is all around that same time period where supposedly across the nation is the City Beautiful movement, right? Where every city is putting up these, beautiful buildings that are only meant to last for, a couple decades at most, and then they're slowly destroyed and replaced with modern buildings.
See, that's the thing. Were they only meant to last a little time?
No, but yeah, that's what we're told. We're told that they built all these grand buildings in this short amount of time frame, but they were just too hard to maintain. Upkeep wasn't worth it anymore. They were dinosaurs. It's time to blow it up and put something modern in its place.
Yeah, up to and including the World Fair buildings.
Yep.
Yeah. So it's it's very mysterious because and so the Yesler building is, they say this was built immediately in the wake of the fire, that the foundation was in place, then the fire happened, and lucky for them, they hadn't started building it yet. So all they had to do was clear away the rubble before the embers cooled, and get in there and start building this, and then it was done in a year. But it
almost does look like two different buildings, Matthew, right? It looks like there's a foundation, and then there's the building was built different.
You're right. There's like this sort of ground plane where it's like one treatment, and then above it, there's this other like exquisite brickwork. Nowadays, this one is still here, fortunately, but the tower is gone. They're always taking the damn towers off.
That's that penis worship, penis envy. Carlin has a bit about it, that's what all wars are. It's just a bunch of prick waving, and that's what they go around and cut it off. It's like a little circumcision of the city.
Well, yeah, you can't have divine masculine power in your architecture.
No.
So this map, I show this in my video, is from 1889. This is a bird's eye view of downtown Seattle before the fire. Okay. And this is this Llewellyn Dodge and Company mining and real estate brokers and auctioneers did this map, and it shows the Pioneer Building. But this map is from before the fire, because this is the core right here. This entire area, what you're seeing at the heart of this map, is the core that was taken out by the fire. All of it was gone, incinerated. But the Pioneer Building is here, and this is a pre-fire map. So again, it's very curious to me, because then all of the history books that I've read, and I told you I read like 25 of them, they all have the Pioneer Building being built immediately after the fire, when all these other thousands of buildings were being built. So it's almost like the time frames don't add up. when you look at the population, you look at the infrastructure and all of that. But even things like post-fire, pre-fire, and post-fire development doesn't, like, the circle doesn't square on that either when you really start digging into it. It's almost like, the time lines were compressed somehow as they're told. And if the history is presented to us through like an analysis of newspaper accounts, it's like, well, whose story are we to believe? The newspaper, the Seattle Post-Intelligencer, that was owned by Henry Yesler, right? In his articles. And if that's what our history is based on, like, no thanks, because I'm gonna keep looking at what I see in these photographs.
Yeah, it's convenient whitewashing, if you ask me. I mean, that's what it's, and it happens again, city after city. There's this similar questions to this about San Francisco that Casey and I had. I have similar questions about some buildings in Chicago, because it just doesn't add up. You look at some of the maps, like and it's ironic because every city seems to have a map like this, where just before the fire, they had an aerial view of the city that they could give to you. And they present it, and then there's a fire, and it, like you said, in the business district, and then you get this new version of the city.
Here's Tacoma, 1893. And you're right. These a lot of these maps were drawn up by E.S. Glover. He's credited with a lot of these, and they're like official like surveys, right, of a particular time or iteration of the city's development. And like, brilliant, like Tacoma, look at all the beautiful
that's amazing. In
brick and stone
1893
buildings, 1893. And this is one of the later ones. He drew up, I'll see if I can find Seattle's, but it says on here's Port Townsend, here's Olympia. I'd love to show all of these. There's one of Seattle, here it is, where it shows on here that this is, yeah, there it is, entered according to Act of Congress in the year 1878 by E.S. Glover in the office of the Librarian of Congress. So this is an official record where they were going around, the cities across the land and, doing a survey and doing an accounting. And what a convenient way to leave out certain things that they don't want to be included in the future of the future of the city. Because when I look through this map, there's a lot of stuff in 1878 that I don't see. A lot of buildings that were built at that time that ain't on this list.
Yep.
Right.
Conveniently, right?
Yeah.
And it's amazing. They can just write the history that they want to tell you when they do things like this. It's a lot like what H.H. Bancroft did in his annals. I mean, there's been people that called him out for BS on his accounts, but that's what they tend to do, right? They tend to credit these one or two gentlemen with either the whole design and building of a city, or the history and the narrative of the city, that they are the be all end all focus of this, and you're just supposed to eat it up and go with it, when these are some shady figures that tend to reappear in multiple cities, and the stories tend to be very similar. So again, we just keep seeing it over and over again, and Seattle's another one of them.
What I remember about reading about Bancroft is that he ran into a lot of conflict with the California Geological Society, and they just about wanted to throw him out on his ear for making stuff up, because
they wrote a whole book on it, Matthew. They wrote a whole book on it, on his fallacies and his untruths that he put out there, and how they told their side of it as true Californians, not some outsider that came out here just to try and rewrite history.
Right.
So if he lied that much about California, think about the story that he told us about the natives, and he's credited with 7 volumes
Right.
worth of information on the natives.
So we base a lot of our own understanding of our history on shady characters like this.
A narrative, yes.
And his name is it's H.H. Bancroft.
They're all HH.
You know what I think that means? Because you have H.H. Richardson. You know, it finally came to, you know what I think that is?
What's that?
Hidden hand.
I think it has something to do with that, because they're all like, and his is Hubert Howe, and the other guy is Henry Harrison. You know, I think
it's hidden hand.
That's brilliant. I never thought about that. HH, great call there. I'm going with it. I don't know if it's true or not, but I like it.
It fits. So where do you want to take this, Matt? Because there's I'm monopolizing the screen here, so I want to show you some cool stuff.
Oh no, I'm wherever you want to steer this. I am along for the ride, because
we're talking about Yesler. Let's look at the Yesler building. So I mentioned that Yesler.
Again, look at the size. Look at the people. They look like little ants in front of it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's beautiful, and it's massive, and it's marvelous, and it's exquisite. Like every detail is considered. This is 1882.
Yep.
You know, and again, like I know at some point I sound like a broken record, but we're talking about just a few thousand inhabitants, and at this time, you know, most people weren't old world master masons. They were millers. You know, they were farmers. They were fishermen. You know, there were people with their homestead. They were probably busy building their own house and with their own garden. Or
this doesn't look like a project where you just gather the local neighborhood folks and get together and decide to build something like this, you know?
Yeah. And
the sacred geometry alone in the building. I mean, look at the windows, the arches, everything, the detail.
Yeah, that's the thing. Like, look at this exquisite arch on the second floor versus the arch on the third floor.
Yeah.
You know, it's each one is unique.
And then you get to the third, then you get to the next level, and it's perfectly round up there. Yeah. I mean, everyone's
it's so exquisite. To look at it, it gives you a sense of like internal harmony and comfort.
And that's why it's so dark on the other side of it, because you see the beauty in these buildings, and then you see how they met their end, and in such a disgraceful and unpleasant manner that didn't have to be.
Yeah. No, it didn't. And again, this is why it's so hard to look at this stuff. Like you can only look at images like this for so long, right, Matt? And like these would kind of haunt my dreams after I spent a few hours like going through them and editing videos and stuff like that. And I just have to take a break from it because it is sinister.
If I ever made a horror movie, Matthew, the main plot would be hunting down these guys in these bowler hats. Like that would be what they were slaying, is these guys, because these are, like you said, these are the guys that haunt me in my nightmares.
Yeah, but you'd have to keep hunting them until you got to the big boss. And you don't know who that is, so be careful what you conjure up.
He's just a dark entity in a bowler hat. Oh, but
let's get rid of this. Let's look at that. So this is what Seattle had, and they had a lot of it, and it was beautiful, and it was marvelous, and it's just, I think.
Now, what did they say these buildings were used for?
Oh, they were hotels, and they were, I imagine they were apartments, and they were houses, and up top, you have the tripartite scheme where you have the business storefronts on the main floor, and then you have your housing or your residential, and then there's always something cool going on up at the top, which is why they want to get rid of all these towers. I want to share this one with you, Matt. This is said to have been built, I believe, 1889, 1890. This is the original courthouse for King Counties, I believe, when this was inaugurated as King County. Originally wasn't it wasn't due to Martin Luther King that it got that name. It was King County for a long time through history. And I'm trying to remember the person who was that name was attributed to, or I think it might have been Kings County in Queen City. I think that's where it came from, Seattle being Queen City.
Okay.
So I think that's the reference. But this is the original courthouse, and it's like, really? And this is just up on the top of a hill, like you mentioned, like where some of these hills, mounds. And if that's the case, then maybe there was an iteration of like urban development where those who came before it was resettled were building structures, powerful buildings like this on top of, pre-existing earthenworks, because those were the energy centers and they were claiming them. I don't know. And
you're good. You are, oh man, we are connected right there, because I was just going to ask you, have you looked in at all to the possibility of ley lines in Seattle? Because there's two things. When I did my research into the ley lines in Europe, I couldn't get any real, I honestly didn't spend a whole lot of time on America, because it's just a huge subject. But what I saw with the ley lines was there was two things. One, that they felt like there was some sort of connection with the ground, but two, that they would rebuild over and over on the same ground because it was quote unquote sacred ground, more or less. And I didn't know, this sounded like when, as you were describing that, like up on a hill, like we mentioned before, mounds and hills are very significant in their building. And then you get into the structure itself, and it's like, oh my Lord, this is just a mammoth. And I wonder if, again, is there a reason why they're building on this site? Is there, because you get into some of these cities and some of the World Fair cities like Seattle, and it seems like they had more purpose than just, this is just to showcase Seattle.
Yeah.
There's something more, and I'm looking at it from an energetic standpoint, getting into a little bit of woo-woo here, from a ley line perspective. But I'm wondering if you have found anything on ley lines or any connections with that.
I'm familiar with the idea, and like the work of maybe like Peter Shampoo, who Mark over at My Family Thinks I'm Crazy has interviewed a number of times, and I've listened. I've listened to the work of Michelle Gibson talking about ley lines in America. I haven't studied specifically Seattle, but it wouldn't surprise me one bit. And I want to, if these buildings were positioned in such a way as to track these energetic points. So here, I've come across a number of these panoramic photos from the time, and you look at the way these are placed. So this is another Central
High school. Yep, of course.
This is the Central
Castle,
High School that I showed you earlier. Yep, right there.
And I don't mean to take you off track real quick, but
Go ahead.
Again, high schools, asylums, orphanages.
Yeah.
What are they doing in all of those? It's re-education, right?
Sure.
And they're taking old castles or old places of power, and they're using them to refuel these batteries and send them out, or just let them die inside if they're not going to take it. Wow.
Yeah, they're definitely rearranging our molecules in these places, for good or for bad, or for, not for indifferent, that's for sure. And like when you look at how they're strung out on this hill, it's this is very powerful.
And they're right in a row.
Yeah.
Right? They're piggyback there on that hill. You have the school, the hospital, and the mansion.
Yeah.
Or library.
Yeah. So what I'm trying to imagine, again, okay, let's just suspend disbelief for a moment and imagine that these buildings were here before the resettlement population showed up. And this was old growth, before these residential houses were developed. This would have been old growth trees, who knows how old, but giant, cedars and Douglas firs. And how extraordinary it must have been to just to visit, to be here, to have witnessed and experienced this site when you had old growth trees. And then, imagine some kind of landscaping, like tying together these buildings set in that type. I mean, it just must have been so amazing.
Yeah, you take out all of those houses on the left-hand side there and just fill that with trees. And you imagine you're going to have a row for those 3 large buildings, and then probably an intersection at the end of the library, and then another row taking you down the Armory Way. And otherwise, it's going to be in the middle of forest for the most part.
And hey, check this out. Now, that same Providence Hospital, which is right here, which, by the way, bless her heart, that's attributed to Sister Mother Joseph, the builder. And I talked about that in one of my videos, that Providence Hospital was basically designed and contracted by the Sister Mother.
Well, and that goes back, Matthew, to the cathedrals of Europe, right? When the monks used to build everything, and
right,
exactly.
Right.
We'll give credit to Sister Mary.
I know the monks built the stone towers in Ireland too.
Yep, of course. Yeah. Look at that, though. What an abomination.
So this is the FBI building. Okay, so we're talking about are these power points, power nodes?
Yeah.
Like, you had a hospital, a healing center, whoever built it, and for however long it was there, that's where it was. They knocked that down and put this up.
A cube.
A modernist, like, sort of like Corbusier type.
Everything's square.
Soulless, cold,
black and white, right? It's digital. It's ones and zeros versus the analog. There's no,
there you go.
It's just,
why couldn't they build this next to it? Why couldn't they build this across the street? No, they had to build it exactly where that old building was.
And that's it. That goes back to the same thing with the cathedrals of France being built on top of Druid places of worship. This is all an energy transfer, right?
Yeah, but we have to forgive the French for building their cathedrals there, because they're so beautiful.
Yeah. Like, oh my God.
At least they leaned into the beauty and the magnificence of architecture and the experience of a place. But like, this is at the heart of, I think, like, the soul sickness in our country.
Yep. It lacks any harmony whatsoever. There's nothing aesthetically pleasing about that at all. It's an eyesore, if you ask me.
It's dark, and it feels malicious.
Yeah, it's like one of those you see in the cartoons, the villain's lair. It's usually just this tall building that's just the same all the way up for stories and stories, and there's nothing, there's no life to it.
It's corporate, and and that's the thing. It's like, does that go along with the idea of incorporation of a city or a town?
Get into the word magic now you're talking my language. I like it.
Yeah, well, Seattle was incorporated in the 1862, I think, or something, and what that allowed was they could then levy a tax.
Yep.
They could tax the population and use that for infrastructure projects and whatnot. But that incorporating, it's a money transaction.
To death, right? In corpse.
It's an energy transfer at the heart of it.
Yeah. And that's and like the point you were alluding to before about this site. I mean, look at it. It went from a place of healing to a place of law enforcement, right? Or a place of punishment.
Mm-hmm.
So now that energy has totally flipped and done a 180. So there's one, line in, if you think of everything as a connected grid, right? An interconnected grid, that's one disconnection right there, right off the bat. That's a spot that has no connection. It's not going to be a conductor to the rest of the grid. It's going to be a consumer.
Right. Right. So again, there it is.
Yep.
There's the Central High School. Here's just this line of buildings, making its way up these hills. And then we look at this Denny Hotel. Let's take a moment for the Denny Hotel, because I just love this building. And they didn't lose that building to the fire. That one was disappeared to the regrade project. And this one reminds me of we were talking about Tacoma. It reminds me of the Stadium High School in Tacoma.
Mm-hmm.
You see this?
Yep.
This was so very similar story, where the building was built as a hotel, and in the late 1880s to early 1990, to the early 1890s, and then it was abandoned for like 10 years, and then somebody else came along and bought it up, and it was abandoned, I guess, because of the economic depression. This is the story. And then it was bought up, and it's finally completed. And unfortunately, in this case, then they did regrade projects, and they just knocked it down, after another few years. So this building supposedly only had a few years of actual use, if it was built in the time frame, on the timeline that they said it was built. So it survives the fire, but then they got to knock it down anyway, because they come along and they got to do this to Seattle, right? All of this was mounds, was hills and valleys. Basically, it was a very hilly terrain here. And this, what we're looking at right now, at the lower part of this image, this is the industrial district. If you're into sports, this would be where Seahawks and Mariners stadiums are right now.
Yep.
And this is the Seattle port. Like, I guess further down a little bit, this is the row of docks and so forth that you can still visit. It's been rearranged so many times, but this is the basic layout. But this was all, hilly terrain with those old buildings that we were just looking at, and they leveled it, they cut, and then they filled. So the further south you go here, now we're going to get into it. The further south you go in this photograph, it becomes the tidal flats, what used to be the tidal flats of the Duwamish territory, really, the Duwamish land. And this is the Duwamish River that had been here for time immemorial. And this is the area that we were just looking at. So what they did is they filled all this in. They cut down the hills on this part of town, and they took all of that fill and they just filled all this in, the tidal flats. You can see it's kind of like rivulets in here.
Yeah.
So you imagine like the life, the aquatic life, the bird life, the everything, the people, human life and culture and history that would have been in this area of where the Duwamish River snakes down like this for thousands of years.
And think of that river as a vein, right? Or an artery, and it's basically cut off at that point.
Yeah, and they took that and they filled it in, and they straightened that out and made it into a shipping canal that is just really problematic for the pollution and for the flooding. Somewhere I have an image of it. That's okay, but you get the idea. This just all got straightened out. And so what they do over and over again is they, with these infrastructure projects and these development projects, is they do not consider, they roll right over nature.
Now, how did they level? The
So,
grounds.
yeah. So the images show, see what I can pull up here.
Because I know in some of the areas that I've looked into where they did quote unquote leveling,
Mhm.
it was really hydro mining. And
That's
they were
what it
just,
appears to be.
yeah, they're just taking these massive hoses and just, you
So
know,
you can see it here. And like,
yeah,
I mean, this is surreal.
that's
Absolutely,
amazing. I mean, look at the
absolutely surreal.
size of that. That's what, a 40, 50-foot hill?
Minimally, probably more. I mean, we're probably talking about well over 100
And
feet on
anybody
some of
that
this.
wonders what they're doing, it's ironic because go check out the Boneyard Alaska on Instagram, because he was, and this guy was just on Rogan recently.
Oh yeah.
Um, he's got the place up in Alaska where he finds a ton of mammoth bones and
Mhm.
tusks and all sorts of stuff. But that's what they do. They take sides of hills and they
Mhm.
just hook up a powerful hose and
Mhm.
they wash it down, and as it erodes, things come out. And
Mhm.
because when I think about that, and you said, oh yeah, they just move this dirt, I'm like, well, they
Yeah,
didn't
what does
really
that
have
mean?
massive trucks or anything, so
Right.
it's almost like they created these mud rivers and let it
Mhm.
settle wherever it may go.
Well, they gave it a place to go, and like I said, they diverted
Yeah,
much of it to the tidal flats. And yeah, can you imagine the
but I mean,
mess of
look at the
these mud
bottom of your
rivers?
screen down here, Matthew. There's a ladder, right? I mean, in that little yeah, there's a ladder right there in the middle,
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
there's some ramps going across. I can't imagine
Right.
how
This would
deep.
have been a river. Yeah, there would have
Yeah.
been a trench. Yeah, how'd you like to be the guy that works down in there digging out this
Oh,
trench?
get out of here. Yeah. I
So
mean,
they
look at
so
the
these
size of some of those
hoses,
boulders right there. Those rocks are massive. They look like
yeah, and they
little
had to get all
pebbles.
this stuff moved. And what gets me though is sure, so this hydro mining and they got this hose connected to Puget Sound.
Yep.
So they're just blasting this with the force of the ocean water, basically. Um, but it's interesting to me, and I would love to talk to a geologist about that, is that this dirt it's pretty like loose, it's silt, basically. You don't see, like, if you imagine up top here before all this tomfoolery happened over the last, like 75 years, like there would have been old growth trees up here.
Yeah.
And but underneath, all of this was just loose soil relatively with a few, chunky rocks in it, but that you could just move mountains literally with a hose is pretty wild. It's not like
And
full of granite and quartz out,
yeah, and you
it's
look at all of them,
bedrock.
all the mounds, they all look uniform. They have this like almost pyramid shape to them.
Yeah, I wonder if that was just a result of like the technique of like starting and working their way out, and eventually these all disappeared too.
Yeah. I just find it interesting that they would leave them in that shape. They got the flat top and it's still a massive hill. And you think a good rainstorm comes in and like you said, it's not the most compact of soil. You get a heavy rainstorm and it washes that in addition to what you got moving with your hydraulic. It could just create mayhem.
And what's confusing to me about it is that they being this region has what they call hard pan. Like the first house that I built in Seattle, I was running the backhoe myself, and you get down to the hard pan, and it's just hard as a rock,
And how far down was that?
just a few feet.
So, but yet this, we're going, what, 50, 60 feet, and we're
Of
seeing
just
nothing but
yeah.
silt.
So that I find to be interesting. Anyway, something to like, one of these things to take note of and wonder about.
Oh, it's a great point because again, it doesn't add up. And this
Mhm.
is what we don't have the answers, guys. I hate to, rain on anybody's parade, but Matthew's not going to come here and just give us all the answers to the history of Seattle. We're bringing more questions to the table than anything based on the observations that we're seeing. And what we're trying to do here is connect dots, right? And you try to make rational, logical things connect. And in instances like this, it's not connecting. There's not a rational or logical path for this based on the narrative that we've been presented.
Yeah, I'd rather have good questions than bad answers.
I'm with you all day. And I got no problem falling on my sword. If I say something stupid and I'm wrong, I will admit to it right away. But in this case, with the Seattle stuff and a lot of these old world cities, I don't know. And that's what you get, is the deeper you dig into it, the more you're like, wow, this doesn't make sense. And I don't have the answer, but I know what I'm reading and what I'm seeing does not make sense.
Everywhere we look.
Yep. And these things, the whole leveling of the city blows my mind. Randy went into our friend Random Randy on the Red Thread podcast, went into a whole big thing on this and talked about it to an extent where they were hydro mining. And that's why you have all the red of, the Grand Canyon and that area, is because they hydro mined up north in Canada and it just washed all the way down. And that's what you're left with in there, is some very, high intensity ore that's almost left behind. So it's an interesting take. I don't know. I haven't looked too deeply into the hydro mining, but it's one of those things that they did back at the turn of the century. And there's not a lot of information about it. It's just kind of, this is what they did and this is what you ended up with.
I look at the Grand Canyon, I think of electrical scarification.
The Lichtenberg.
Yes.
Figures. I'm with you, because that's exactly what it looks like. It looks like scarring.
Yeah. Yeah. You look at Valles Marineris on the surface of Mars, and it cuts a third of the way across the face of the planet. And it's like Grand Canyon times 100 or something. It's massive. And the at the end of the fractal line of the the carved out canyon, like they suggest that was evidence that there was water there. I mean, there may well have been water on Mars, but those what appear to be rivulets at the end of these long branches, fractal branches, don't have outlets. They're scooped.
Yeah. And we know water's going to follow the path of least resistance, and it's going to keep going.
Yeah. It sure does. It sure does seem that, there were other forces at play in carving up the landscape, it conjures up language that would be like biblical language.
Yeah.
Where, mountains are cast down and valleys are carved out.
And what time frame are they talking on this? The leveling of the city, that is.
Now we're talking about Seattle?
Yes.
Okay. So the regrade projects in Seattle, as I understand it, there was sort of like the first couple decades of the early 1900s, the first couple decades of the 1900s. And it did go on for decades. And as I said earlier, it wasn't just the Denny regrade, which is like the most famous, but it's also like Jackson Hill. And there was like 5 different regrade sites where they were just going to town on this city and what was here. But it just went on and on and on, where so you hear about Seattle's past being like a dingy, dirty, mucky mess. Well, they kind of made it that way. So here is drawing, this is showing an artist's rendering of what it would have looked like in 1852. And this whole area up here, this knob, would have been Denny Hill and Pioneer Square. So if you take First Avenue, that used to be Front Street.
Okay.
Keep in mind, 1852, right? And again, this is just a sketchy sketch, but it's showing like a sort of a shared understanding of what was here, where this was all still part of Elliott Bay, and these were like 50, 100 foot, 200 foot cliffs coming down to the water line, basically. So you have First Avenue, which was Front Street, and you have Yesler Way. This is where those buildings that we looked at earlier Yes, the Yesler building and the Occidental building were right here. So at this intersection. So this all supposedly somehow before the industrial, scale regrade projects, all of this got filled
Yeah, that's
in
bizarre.
just like the previous 25 years and then built on with those old world looking buildings.
Yeah.
I'm not getting it, Matt.
That's one where you're like, what? Hold
I'm,
on. Can you say that again? Because
I'm
that
not
doesn't
getting
make
it.
any sense.
There's only so much sawdust, that the mills, like Yesler's mill, and they said they took that sawdust and dumped it in, to fill up the land. These are the silly stories that were given about how all this happened.
Oh
I'm
my
so
God.
I'm not, you know, I'm
Yeah, we're
not
gonna fill the
understanding what I'm
bay with
seeing.
sawdust. That's gonna give us a good foundation to build old world buildings on.
Right.
Yep. Makes
Right.
sense.
And again, I
Unbelievable.
just to drive this home, I want to find that picture one more time of Front Street, which is First Avenue. This.
Because you just look at the size of those cliffs, and and now I'm thinking, oh, it's basically flat to the water line now. Man.
So you tell me, because
It's
how do you get from this in 1852 to this, in 1882, basically 30 years later?
30 years. Yep. And we're talking, under 100,000 population.
No, like under 10,000.
That's right. It wasn't until 1900 they got to 100,000. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, under 10,000. That's what I'm saying. Like this first half cent or the second half of the 19th century, 1850 to 1900, that's pivotal. That's key because that's where like all these like contradictions,
Yep.
kind of like come to a head.
Yeah, and that's across the country. That's for sure.
It's city after city after city. I mean, I'm really looking forward to getting into Tacoma. I'd love to go. I know some folks up in Port Townsend. Port Townsend, it's another, mystery inside of a riddle, inside of an enigma. They have an underground in Port Townsend, and it's like a really remote town way up on the top of the Olympic Peninsula. And they've got old world buildings up there, and they have an underground. And it's like, how did, so we have the story of Seattle's underground where they did these regrade projects and they came in and they raised the highways, but these are relatively speaking modern infrastructure projects after the Great Fire and into the 1900s. But Port Townsend was really remote, and so how do you explain Port Townsend having an underground? So all over this region, I know Jared Boosters. You're familiar with him. He just did a video on Portland, old world Portland, taking a very similar type of a look at Portland's built history. So this is just a really fascinating time to be alive, really, where it feels like a lot of what was missing and from our history and hidden from our past is starting to be revealed.
Yeah, it's funny you say that because John Levi just put out a video today about Tacoma
Okay,
and
cool.
and Wyoming. He
Uh-huh.
put about the Ames Monument out in Wyoming, that pyramid that's out there.
You know who is attributed with having built that or designed it?
Who's that?
H. Richardson.
Yes. Yep.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'll have to watch that. But there's almost too much to keep up with, and that's why I was hesitant about starting my own podcast. It's like the world doesn't need another podcaster, but
No,
at the
but
same time,
it doesn't, but it needs someone like you who's bringing quality information. There's a big difference, right? I mean, the 3 videos that I've seen so far on the Seattle have been just, I mean, top notch. I mean, that's education level stuff there, and that's stuff people need. What we don't need is people going around and just interviewing the same people and repeating the same thing over and over again.
Yeah.
You're bringing a fresh perspective, and on top of it, you have the background and you carry the badge that you can certify this stuff. You walk it every day and have been for the past 30 years.
I mean, I grew up with a hammer in my hand, so going on 50. I'm 50 now, Matt. Yeah. But
well, I figured you did a little party in the first 20, so I gave you the benefit of the doubt.
You'd be surprised what I built before I was 20.
Oh, it does. I would not be surprised, not with what you're due.
But yeah, I mean, actually, I was lucky enough to go to high school when they still had vocational training. Like I took 3 years of architectural drafting in high school, before computers, and I took 3 years of woodshop, and I had a really good woodshop teacher, so I still have furniture around here that I built when I was 15 in high school. So I've been at this a long time. But the other thing of it is, I have an architecture degree, studied at New Jersey Institute of Technology. Shout out to Newark, New Jersey. And but also my wife is a PhD, right? And so I'm constantly getting that feedback where she doesn't let me get away with stuff. Like, I'm like, honey, look at this cool thing that I saw or whatever, figured out. And she's like, how does that figure? So it's like I can suspend disbelief when I watch like a John Levy film, right? I could kind of just let my imagination wander. But she reins me back in, and she's like, well, how, show me, like, take the book. Don't just, go through Wikipedia, get the books out of the library. And she's kind of holding my feet to the fire on that front. And it's been really helpful for me to kind of, sharpen my pencils and really take a hard look at, the written history, the written documentation alongside of, these photos that we're seeing.
And that's what's important, because too many people, and granted, there's some people that do great work on YouTube with just flashing videos or photos up there, but they're also a dime a dozen. And there's people that do it and they're on to the next city. They read one book and put out a 20-minute video, and that's it. And it's, it's very, I want to say elementary, it's just top level. Whereas you got into
surface level.
Yeah, you could tell it was well researched, and that's what I like to do. Every now and then I'm presenting, okay, I want to present you this book because I found cool information in it. But when I'm doing, like when I did my Chicago, I'm like you, I think I think I'm up to like over 35 books now on the World Fair and the history of Chicago, the fire, all that stuff, because I want to have my information come from multiple sources. And like your wife's doing, I like to play devil's advocate with myself sometimes, because I'm like, okay, this seems obvious to me. Let's play the other side of it and say, well, this is stupid. Prove it to me. And then I got to go on a wild goose chase and find the information to try and prove it to myself. And I think that's the mark of taking it to the next level, when you've done that research and you can verify it and feel confident about putting it out, or feel confident saying, okay, I've done X amount of research, and here's the question that still remains about this. I don't know, but I want, collective eyes. Hopefully somebody can get to the bottom of this. But after, hundreds of hours of research, I still can't answer this question. There's something wrong with that.
Right. Yeah. And it's like, it's like you said, we don't have the answers, and I don't know the truth. I know I can look at an image like this and say, yeah, these were brick buildings and not wooden. So I get closer to a truth that starts to emerge, like a new picture is starting to emerge. But like Howdy Mikowski says it well, where it's like, you can't prove things true. You can only prove things. What does he say? You can only prove things not false, I think is how he puts it. And you just keep taking away the stuff that are demonstrably, I might be getting that a little bit mixed up, but the general idea is, the truth, a truth starts to emerge on its own when we get rid of what is not true. right?
Absolutely. Yeah, I can't prove anything really because I wasn't there. I didn't see it with my own eyes. But based on research, I can start pushing things to the side and saying, okay, this doesn't make sense. So I don't believe this to be true. And then
Yeah,
move on to the next one. And then slowly, as you start hacking away those untruths, now you're left with a smaller subset. And you can say, okay, now I can look at these. And now some of these are true. Now, okay, now we got somewhere to go. But they've
right.
done it's such a layered deception in all this too, Matthew, that
Yeah,
it's well orchestrated. They've done it over and over again, as we see city by city. So it's not something they just did by the fly of their pants.
that's
It's
that's the thing that is, you know, I mean, you have to give the devil its due, right? Like
Mhm.
it gets unsettling when you look at that aspect of it, because you can see you can see an unfoldment that's going on for decades and centuries, right? Where what happened in the 1850s, and you fast forward to the 1950s, and it's just like this, it's like the same hand is at work,
Yep.
right? Like the infrastructure projects they did as a result of the regrade. Well, they needed the fire to happen first to clear out the downtown, right? So that they could start, leveling what was there and start putting in the new, and right. And so it's they're sowing the seeds for what's to follow, but they're doing it over really long time frames. And here I want to share this picture with you, and I don't want to linger here too long because this is kind of spooky.
Ooh,
What the hell is this, man? This is
yeah.
this is 1920-ish, downtown Seattle.
First of all, the first thing I see, aside from the floating crosses all the way down, is that pentagram on the left.
Yeah.
That is upside down pentagram. Obviously, we know what that symbolizes. And then I don't even know. It almost looks like a black cross on the right hand side in that, or black sun, I mean,
Mm-hmm.
in that other flag. But man, what a bizarre photo.
And you have the Masonic,
There's the Freemasons. Yep.
the Freemason with the square and the compass, the 3 and the 4 making 7, and G being the 7th letter, and all that good stuff. But
And that pentagram one is right above Quaker drugs.
yeah, where have you seen that before? Quaker drugs.
Yeah.
Good catch.
Oh my gosh.
And so the caption that came along with this photo was like, the day the Templars came to town.
Yep.
And is is this a tip of the hat to who's behind all this? Again,
These are the
just asking
inheritors.
questions.
Yeah. Well, if you keep seeing the same people reemerge as these cities are rebuilt, and you see the same names over and over again too. So it's
Yeah, I
not
could.
too much of a stretch.
Speaking of, oh, sorry about that. Speaking of the hidden hand, I just want to, doggone it, can't control my. So I want to show you H. Richardson. You'll appreciate this.
It's probably one of those typical our favorite men who sit there and pose.
Ah, there he is, the hidden
There
hand.
you go. HH.
Yeah.
I'm running with that now because that's
All right.
so true. And I never figured out why. I'm like, how the hell do all these guys have their name HH? It's like, damn, that's a coincidence.
Now, the interesting thing about him, and one of the interesting things, like I'm reading a biography on him, and I want to do a whole episode diving into his legacy and looking deeper at this book. And I actually like to reach out to this author to see if he'll want to talk about that stuff. But like he's attributed some ungodly amount of structures, like like 50 buildings in just maybe like 4 years, 4 or 5 years.
Well,
And each one is a masterpiece.
and to add to the symbolism, look at his jacket or his, his vest and his tie. You got blue and gold, which are those straight Masonic colors.
Oh, that was always the Cub Scouts for me. The blue and the gold.
Yeah. The blue and gold now, that's a dead giveaway in my eyes. That's that blue and yellow.
So he's
like a almost like a Burnham of
like when you look
West.
at, like, he's said to have designed Trinity Church in Boston as his first.
That was his first.
His right out of the gate. He was like
Okay.
fresh out of the college kind of thing. He was a fair to Midland student. He was sickly. He was like 350 pounds and had like he was constantly in bed, constantly sick. And he's said to have designed Trinity Church while in bed sick. And then he's given, oops, sorry about that. Then he's given like Allegheny courthouse in was that Pittsburgh?
Yep. So what does he do? He just works his way west?
Well, it's the influence, right? So that's why they call it Richardsonian Romanesque.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. He starts out in the east and it just slowly spreads to the west.
Yeah, but not slowly, very quickly. Like all of a sudden, all at once. There's Spokane. If you look at the Spokane, you and I started looking at courthouses for a minute.
Yep.
If you look at the Spokane courthouse, it looks just like this.
Yeah.
It looks just like this. And so these are the type of buildings that this guy was cranking out. Like, let's see, if he did 40, like 8 of them a year for a few years, but while he's sick and in bed. And then at the same time, I hate to do this to him because he's my hero. So this is all about slaying sacred cows. He was my hero, like him and Frank Lloyd Wright and Louis Sullivan. If you Richardson house design, because this is where I know we're kind of getting off topic here.
They're like castles. And I love the fact that these guys, they just come out of nowhere too. And they just build empires. Olmsted, Root, Burnham. I mean, just the names over and over and over.
Amateur. There's no sense of like scale and proportion and materiality. Certainly, you know what I mean? Like, it doesn't make sense that this would be the same architect. So what is it that we're calling Richardsonian Romanesque? All these buildings, all these like old world looking buildings. See if I get back to that. Allegheny, or I'll just write Spokane courthouse. Like, to me, that's another indication that those buildings were already there and they're just doing attribution.
Now, who built them? That's the question,
right?
And that's kind of where that's where I'm digging right now, is to try and find out, who are the natives, and not the Indians per se. Who were the natives before the Indians? Because the Indians, in a lot of tales, when they talk of structures and mounds and such, they say they were already there. They're just protecting them. They're guarding them for the previous builders, and who they are, they don't know, or they won't say, at least to us. So
yeah, that's the question, the perennial question. It's like, well, this is Trinity Church in Boston. This is supposed to be his first out of college kind of a thing. And
Of
it's just,
course.
I'm not, I'm just not buying it. Like, I believe there's genius and there are inspired,
I mean, look
creators
at the
among us,
geometry
but
in that. That's just a beautiful building. I mean,
it's
that's your
stunning.
first, just
Yeah.
straight out the gate. You're going to crank that out.
Yeah. And the interiors are equally impressive. Um, it's a masterwork. And so it's almost a mockery of the builders to just kind of create this cartoon history
Yeah.
that we have. But the question of like, what did the Indians know, that comes up? People write that in the comments. And I wonder myself, but who has anybody taken the time to ask them?
Well, and a
And
lot of the research that I've done into that so far, and I've just done surface level stuff, is a lot of their tales are oral, and there's not a
Mhm.
ton that's written down. So, and they were very hesitant to tell it outside to outsiders. So
Mhm.
when it comes down to getting this history, unless you can find, someone who still has that connection to the oral history, you're not going to find it in a written text, so to
Right.
speak.
Here's the
And
interior,
oh,
by the way, of
wow,
Trinity Church.
look at
It's just
that.
breathtaking.
It's a work of art.
So yeah, and so oral history mixed with 200 years of destabilization and relocation and re-education, and then at the end of all that, if there's elders amongst them that hold secrets of their past, like, how much of that are they going to be so ready to share with the outside world? So again, it's the questions like, what did the Indians know? What did they see? It's like, good question. Maybe we can ask and and see what they have to offer.
Yeah, it's amazing. Man, this is a mind
So
blower, my friend. This is just one bit of Seattle, right? We just touched the surface here of Seattle. We could probably go for another 2 hours and still not hit all of what we want to talk about. I know we didn't even touch on the fairs at all. And we can do that another time if we want, but it's it's just the same story over and over, and that's what is disheartening in a sense, is that I see in your work the same thing that I found when I dug through Chicago, and it's a similar story in other cities across the states too, and
mhm.
we just
Well,
don't get the real story, and
it,
that's
it
what's the most frustrating.
it can be disheartening and it is frustrating. The way I look at it now is that anywhere you pull on a thread, the fabric of the narrative starts to unravel,
Yes.
right? So you can go crazy, like pulling on all the threads, and it's like, well, this thing over here and this thing over here. But if you zoom out and you look at there's a fabric, right? And and we know that ain't so. We just don't know what's behind it, and
Yep.
what's behind it is starting to emerge. So it's an awesome time to be alive and all that. Like, there's this sense of like an awakening and a heightening of awareness to some things that happened in our past, much of which is it's unsettling. But I think if we can kind of see through that, something really remarkable starts to emerge as well.
Yep.
Like, I find it to be extraordinary to know that this type of architecture has existed in Seattle, and why and there's remnants around. Like, I can visit remnants, and people can go around, just look around them where they are now, and just look for the artifacts, because they're all over, hidden in plain sight.
Yeah, and even if you're in a small town, there's gonna be history there. There's gonna be old architecture there, or stories of old architecture there, and you can go check out or find the nearest city to you, something you can go touch and go take a look and do what Matthew's doing here in Seattle and in Washington. And guys, if everybody does their part and just pulls on that thread a little bit, we're going to start to make some headway here. But collectively, there's just not enough eyes in the game yet to get there. But we're making progress. So I want to thank you, my friends, because you've changed the way I look at a few things and have gotten me to ask myself some questions. And you're a great source to be able to bounce information off of with your knowledge and expertise. So thank you very much.
I appreciate that, Matt. Thank you. Thank you for getting me. You were my inspiration to actually finally launch a podcast of my own and just, start putting my own ideas forward, throwing my hat into the ring. So thank you for the inspiration, really. And you're doing amazing work, Matt. Like, don't underestimate the power of the influence that you're having on a lot of people.
Oh, I thank you. That means a lot coming from you, sir. It really does. Where can everybody find the Marvelous Old World?
Well, for now, it's on YouTube. I don't have the bandwidth to figure out the Spotify thing, but I will eventually. So Marvelous Old World at YouTube, and then my architecture work is at dreamdesignbuild.org and on Instagram at Yurt Designs, because I design wooden yurt houses.
Beautiful. Beautiful. And
a lot of fun.
If you do decide you want to go the podcast route, let me know. I will give you a hand getting that set up and everything. Because honestly, I think people need to hear your work. They need to see it. You do a great job, and anything I can do to help you out, I will do, because not only do you do great work, you're an even better person. And I thank you, my friend, for being there. And this is a beautiful thing we got going here. So let's keep it going, and we will do this again shortly. Everybody stay strong and question